They say some moments haunt you forever. Some secrets you carry in your heart, locked away, hoping they never see the light of day. You move on, you build a new life. You tell yourself you've left it behind, but some memories don't fade. It's been years since that summer. Years. And yet, every time I close my eyes, I'm right back there. The warm air. The hum of crickets outside my window. The way the ceiling fan spun slowly in the dead of night, making that soft click-click-click sound. I remember how my fingers would dig into my pillow, gripping it like a lifeline, trying to steady my own thoughts. Because back then, I was drowning in something I didn't understand. Before I was a wife, before I had my own family, there was a part of my life I never speak about. And maybe after today, I never will again. I was young, confused, lonely in a way I didn't even know was possible. You think you know loneliness when you sit by yourself at lunch or when no one answers your texts. But the kind of loneliness I felt, it was different. It was the kind that lingers even when you're surrounded by people. The kind that eats away at you in silence. I thought I knew myself. Thought I knew what was right, what was wrong. Thought I could control my feelings, my emotions, my desires. I was wrong. And the worst part? It didn't happen all at once. It was slow, subtle, like the way the ocean pulls you in, inch by inch, until suddenly your feet can't touch the ground anymore. I wish I could say I saw it coming, that I recognized the danger before it was too late. But the truth is, I didn't. Or maybe I did. And I just ignored it. See, when my mother passed away, my whole world changed. Nothing felt the same. The house felt empty, even when it was full of people. My father, well, he did what men do. He grieved the way society tells them to, quietly, in the background, until one day he just moved on. And moving on meant one thing. A new wife, a new life, a new family. And with that new family came him. I remember the first time I saw him. My father's new wife's son. My stepbrother. Or, I guess, my half-brother if you want to be technical. But titles never really mattered, did they? Not in the ways that count. Because from the very beginning, something felt off. Not in a way that screamed danger. Not in a way that made me run. No, it was quieter than that. Softer. More insidious. It was the way he looked at me. Not right away, not at first. But over time, little things. The way his eyes lingered a second too long. The way he would always sit just a little too close. The way his voice would drop just a little lower when he spoke to me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. That I was overthinking. That I was just sensitive because my whole life had been turned upside down. But then, one night, something happened. Something small. Something that shouldn't have mattered. But it did. Because that was the night I knew. The night I realized that I was standing on the edge of something dangerous. And once you see the edge, once you feel it beneath your toes, it's hard to step back. And even harder not to fall. But before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever been caught in a situation where love, desire, and morality blurred together? Where you questioned everything you thought you knew about yourself? Because if you have, then you'll understand. And if you haven't, then I hope you never do. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done? And if you want more stories like this, stories that pull you deep into the shadows of the human heart, make sure to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because trust me, this story is only just beginning. I don't know exactly when I stopped feeling like I belonged in my own home. Maybe it was after my mother's funeral, when people whispered about my father, how young he still was, how he couldn't be expected to live the rest of his life alone. Maybe it was the first time I saw him laughing again, his wedding ring still on his finger, while my mother's clothes sat untouched in the closet, gathering dust. Or maybe it was the day he told me he had met someone. I remember the way he said it. Like it was nothing. Like it was just another conversation at the dinner table. Linda, I want you to meet someone. That's all it took. One sentence. 10 little words. And suddenly, everything changed. Her name was Miriam. She was beautiful, of course. The kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. Long, dark hair. A soft, sweet smile. Younger than my father, but not young enough to raise eyebrows. She had a warmth to her, something delicate in the way she spoke. She tried, at least in the beginning. She would ask me questions about school, about my favorite books, about my friends. She always wanted to help, to cook my favorite meals, to sit next to me on the couch and braid my hair. I think she truly believed she could fill the space my mother left behind. But the thing is, that space wasn't empty. It was raw, exposed. And no matter how gentle her hands were, every time she reached for me, it felt like touching an open wound. I wanted to like her. I really did. But how do you welcome someone into your life when you're still grieving the one they're replacing? My father, though, he adored her. He smiled more, laughed more, held her hand at the dinner table like a man who had been given a second chance. And with every touch, every shared glance between them, I felt myself fade further into the background. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just in my head. But I wasn't. Because when Miriam moved in, my father stopped seeing me. His world became her. His attention, his time, his love, all of it. I became an afterthought, a shadow in my own home. I stopped eating dinner at the table, stopped talking to him unless I had to. And he barely noticed. I spent a lot of time in my room that year. Books became my escape. I would lie in bed for hours, the words on the page pulling me into someone else's life, someone else's pain. Anything to forget my own. And then, one day, everything shifted. Because Miriam didn't just come alone. She had a son, Isaac. The first time I met him, he barely spoke. Just stood there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans, looking at me like I was something to figure out. He was quiet. Not shy, just observing. Like he saw things other people didn't. His presence in the house felt strange at first. A reminder that this wasn't just my home anymore. That my mother's world had been erased and replaced with something unfamiliar. I tried to ignore him. For a while, I pretended he wasn't there. I kept to myself, shut my door, stayed buried in my books. But Isaac, he had a way of slipping through the cracks. At first, it was small things. Passing each other in the hallway, brushing shoulders just slightly, long enough for me to notice, but too short to call it intentional. Sitting across from me at dinner, his eyes flickering up every so often, watching me in a way that felt different. There was something in his gaze, something unreadable. Not hostility, not exactly. Just awareness. And I hated how aware it made me. I told myself I was overthinking, that it was just in my head. But then, one night, I caught him staring. Not a glance. Not something fleeting. A stare. Deep. Unmoving. Like he was trying to see past my skin, past my bones, into something deeper. And when our eyes met, he didn't look away. He held it. Longer than he should have. Long enough for my stomach to tighten, for my pulse to pick up, for something deep inside me to whisper that this was not normal. But I didn't say anything. I just turned away, pretending I hadn't noticed. Because what else was I supposed to do? Looking back now, I should have paid attention. I should have listened to that feeling in my gut, that little voice warning me that something was wrong. But at the time, I was too lost in my own world to see it. Too numb from everything else in my life to realize that something was creeping in. Something I wouldn't be able to stop. Not when I wasn't even sure if I wanted to. It started on a night like any other. Nothing special. Nothing unusual. Just another evening in a house that no longer felt like mine. Miriam had planned a quiet family night, something she liked to do, even though it always felt forced. She had this idea in her head that we could all be normal. That if she just tried hard enough, cooked the right meals, smiled at the right times, we could pretend we were something other than a collection of strangers under one roof. So that night, she made dinner. A big one. Candles on the table, soft music playing in the background. My father, of course, was in his usual place, sitting at the head of the table, distracted by his phone, nodding along to whatever conversation he was half listening to. Miriam kept talking about her day, about a show she was watching, about something she read in a magazine. She always filled the silence. But the whole time, across the table, I felt him. Isaac. Sitting there, quiet as always. watching. I didn't look at him. Not at first. I focused on my plate, on the food in front of me, on anything but the weight of his gaze. But the thing about being watched? You feel it. And when I finally glanced up, just for a second, just long enough to check, to confirm, I found him already looking. Not in that way people glance at each other across the room. Not in the way family members exchange brief, passing looks. It was different. Steady. Focused. Like he was waiting for something. Like he wanted to see what I would do. I should have looked away. I meant to. But for some reason, I didn't. Instead, I just held it. That moment. That look. And for a split second, something in the air shifted. Subtle. Barely there. But enough. Enough to make my fingers tighten around my fork. Enough to make my stomach feel strange, a mix of unease and something I didn't want to name. Enough to make the noise around me blur, as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving just the two of us in a place neither of us should have been. And then, just as quickly, he smirked. Not a full smile. Just the smallest twitch of his lips, barely noticeable. Like he knew. Like he had seen something in me before I had even seen it myself. And that scared me more than anything. After dinner, I went straight to my room. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was being ridiculous. He was my stepbrother. Nothing more. It didn't matter that we weren't raised together. It didn't matter that we were only connected by marriage, that we had spent years living separate lives. None of that mattered. Because in the eyes of the world, we were family now. And whatever that moment had been at the dinner table, whatever that look was, I couldn't let it mean anything. I wouldn't let it. But it didn't stop there. Because later that night, something else happened. Something small. Something that shouldn't have mattered. But it did. It was late. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles deep into the walls, into the bones of a place. I was in the kitchen, getting water, trying to shake off the feeling that had been following me all night. And then, footsteps. Slow. Unhurried. I turned, already knowing who it would be. Isaac. Leaning against the doorframe, watching me. That same unreadable look in his eyes. Couldn't sleep? He asked. His voice was calm. Too calm. I nodded, gripping the glass in my hand a little tighter. Yeah. Just needed water. Silence. Not awkward. Not exactly. Just. Charged. And then he stepped forward. Just one step. Not enough to make it seem intentional, but enough to feel it. You've been avoiding me, he said, his voice lower this time. I let out a small, nervous laugh. What? No, you have. Another step. Closer. Not too close. But close enough. Close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the quiet tension in the space between us. Close enough that I couldn't ignore it. I swallowed, forcing a smile, trying to make it feel normal. You're imagining things. His eyes didn't move from mine. Am I? That was the moment I knew. The moment I stopped being able to lie to myself. Because there was something there. Something neither of us had said aloud, but both of us felt. I could hear it in the silence. See it in the way he looked at me. And I hated that a part of me didn't want to run. I told myself I was imagining it. That I was overthinking. But deep down I knew. I knew. Something had changed. And there was no going back. After that night in the kitchen, something changed. Or maybe it had already changed, and I was just finally admitting it to myself. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way Isaac moved through the house, how his presence seemed heavier somehow, how his silence always felt like it carried something unspoken. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Not really. But it was in the little things. The way he started standing closer to me than necessary. The way his voice dropped when he spoke to me, softer, more deliberate. The way his eyes lingered too long, like he was waiting for me to react. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. It was subtle. Deliberate. Like a game where neither of us admitted we were playing. And yet, I kept telling myself it was nothing. That I was imagining it. That I was reading too much into things, seeing something where there was nothing. After all, he was my stepbrother. Not by blood, not by childhood, but by circumstance. Family, at least in the way people saw us. So why was I questioning everything? Why did my heart beat faster when he walked into a room? Why did my stomach twist every time he looked at me that way? I told myself it was loneliness. That it was just because I had felt invisible for so long, and now, suddenly, someone was noticing me. That was all it was. Attention. The kind I hadn't had in years. And I was just confused. That had to be it. Right? But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Because he wasn't just noticing me. He was watching me. Not in a creepy way, not in a way that would make someone else see anything wrong. But in a way that felt intentional. And more than that, it felt possessive. Like he knew something I didn't. I started catching myself watching him too. At dinner, when he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying me like I was some puzzle he was trying to solve. In the living room, when he stretched out on the couch, acting casual but always facing me, always aware of exactly where I was. Even in passing, when we brushed against each other in the hallway, his hand barely grazing mine. And every time I told myself it was nothing. Just normal. Just coincidence. But it wasn't. Then, one night, it happened again. Another small moment. Another nothing that felt like everything. It was late, past midnight. The house was quiet, dark. I had been in my room, reading, trying to distract myself from the thoughts circling my mind. And then I heard it. A soft knock. Barely there. I hesitated. And then I opened the door. Isaac stood there, one hand against the doorframe, looking down at me. Couldn't sleep? He asked. His voice was quiet. Almost intimate. I swallowed. No. You. A small shake of his head. His eyes never left mine. The air felt thick. Charged. Like something unspoken was hanging between us, waiting for one of us to reach out and touch it. I could have stepped back. Closed the door. Ended the moment before it became something more. But I didn't. I just stood there. Waiting. For what, I don't know. Looking back, I think that was the moment I should have walked away. Should have put distance between us before it was too late. But the truth is, I didn't want to. And maybe that was the real problem. I spent the next few days trying to act normal. Trying to convince myself that nothing had happened. That it was just a late-night conversation. That I was making a big deal out of nothing. But my body knew better. Because every time he walked into the room, my breath caught in my throat. Every time his eyes met mine, I felt something I didn't want to feel. And every time he touched me, even just a brush of fingers, just a passing hand against my back, it sent a quiet shiver down my spine. I told myself it was in my head. That he was just being nice. That I was overthinking. That I was wrong. But then, one evening, something happened that made me realize I wasn't. It was late again. I had gone outside for some air, the cool night pressing against my skin, the darkness wrapping around me like a blanket. I had been walking, slowly, just around the backyard, lost in thought. And then, he was there. I hadn't even heard him approach. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, voice low. I turned, startled. "I'm fine." He stepped closer. Not too close. But close enough. The moonlight cast shadows across his face, his expression unreadable. "It's late," he said again, softer this time. I felt my pulse in my throat. I nodded, turning to walk back toward the house. And then, his hand brushed against mine. Not accidental. Not this time. Deliberate. And when I looked up, his eyes were already waiting for mine. Heavy. Intentional. And in that moment, I knew. Knew that we had crossed some invisible line neither of us had spoken about. Knew that whatever this was, whatever we had been pretending wasn't happening, was real. And it scared me. Because I didn't know how to stop it. And worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to. There's a moment in every story like this. A moment where the line between right and wrong blurs so much, you stop seeing it altogether. Where you convince yourself that nothing is happening until it is. That moment came for me slowly, creeping in like the tide, until I was too deep to pull myself back. It started with the smallest things. Touches that shouldn't have meant anything. A hand on my lower back as he passed by. A lingering brush of fingers when he handed me something. His knee pressing against mine under the dinner table. Small. innocent. At least, that's what I told myself. But I felt them. Every single one. Because they weren't accidents. They were deliberate. Intentional. And the worst part? I didn't pull away. And then, there were the looks. The kind of eye contact that lasts too long, stretches out into something thick and unspoken. The kind that makes your breath hitch in your throat, that makes you look away first because you don't trust yourself to keep holding it. But the thing about Isaac? He never looked away first. Our conversations changed too. They became something else. More personal. More secretive. The kind of talks that felt like they belonged in the dark, away from listening ears. Late at night, when the rest of the house was asleep, we'd find ourselves in the kitchen, in the backyard, in the hallway outside our rooms. And we'd talk. Not about things that mattered. Not at first. But there was always something beneath the words. A tension. A pull. I could hear it in the way his voice dropped when he spoke to me. See it in the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. And sometimes I'd test it. I'd say something teasing, something playful, just to see how he'd react. And he'd smile. Not a normal smile. A slow one. Knowing, like he was waiting for me to admit something I wasn't ready to say. And the more we talked, the closer we got, the harder it became to pretend. People started noticing. Not in a big way, not at first. Just little things. Miriam would smile sometimes when she saw us talking, that knowing, motherly smile that made my stomach turn. "It's nice that you two are getting close," she said once. My father barely looked up from his phone when she said it. Just nodded. I forced a smile, tried to act normal. But Isaac? He just looked at me. And for a second, I could feel what he was thinking. We were getting close. But not in the way they thought. Not in the way they should have thought. The fear of being caught should have been enough to stop it. But it wasn't. It only made it worse. Because the more dangerous it felt, the harder it was to resist. The thrill of something forbidden, something unsaid, pressing against the edges of what we knew was wrong. And then, there was that night. The night everything shifted. The night I stopped pretending. I remember every detail. The way the air felt thick, like it carried something heavy inside of it. The way the house was too quiet, too still. The way my heart pounded for reasons I didn't want to admit. I had been reading in my room, trying to distract myself, trying to ignore the way my body felt charged every time I thought about him. Then, a soft knock. Not loud, not demanding. Just there. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. And when I did, when I saw him standing there, something in me shattered. Because I knew that whatever was happening between us had already gone too far. And I knew that if I let him in, if I didn't shut the door right then and there, everything would change. Everything. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood there, looking at me. Like he was waiting. Like he was giving me a choice. And I should have chosen differently. I should have stepped back, should have closed the door, should have put an end to whatever this was before it could become something more. But I didn't. I just stood there. Breathless. Waiting. For what, I don't know. But then, he took a step forward. Not enough to touch me. Not yet. But close enough to feel. Close enough to know what came next. And in that moment, with the air between us thick and unspoken, I realized something. I wanted this. I had been lying to myself all along. It wasn't loneliness. It wasn't confusion. It was him. It had always been him. And in that moment, I stopped fighting it. There are moments in life you can never take back. Moments that change everything. And the worst part is, you can feel them coming. Like the way the air shifts before a storm. The way your heartbeat betrays you before you even know why. I should have stopped it. I should have slammed the door. I should have looked him in the eye and said, "This can't happen." But I didn't. I let the silence stretch between us. Let it grow thick, heavy. Let him step inside. I don't even remember moving. One moment, I was at the door. The next, he was in my room. The door clicking shut behind him sounded too final. Too deliberate. I should have said something. I should have told him to leave. Instead, I just stood there. Watching him. Watching the way his chest rose and fell, the way his fingers curled at his sides like he was holding himself back. watching the way his eyes never left mine. Like he was waiting. Like he was giving me one last chance to stop this before it was too late. And maybe that was the worst part. Because I didn't want to stop it. Not anymore. Say it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed. Say what? That you don't feel this. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to say it. I wanted to look him in the eye and tell him this was nothing, that whatever was happening between us was in his head, that I wasn't thinking about him when I lay awake at night, heart pounding for reasons I didn't want to admit. I wanted to tell him to walk away, to leave me alone, to pretend this never happened. But I couldn't, because it wasn't nothing. And we both knew it. He took a step closer. Not too close, but close enough. I could feel the heat of him, the way the air between us pulsed with something neither of us had the strength to fight anymore. His hand lifted, hesitant, slow. And then, his fingers grazed my wrist. Soft, barely there. But enough. Enough to make my breath catch in my throat. Enough to make my skin burn where he touched me. Enough to make my body betray me completely. Because I didn't pull away. I should have. But I didn't. He stepped closer. So close, I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. So close, I could see the flicker of something dark in his eyes, hesitation, desire, restraint all tangled into one. And for a moment, everything else disappeared. The walls, the house, the weight of what this meant. There was only him. Only the unspoken pull between us, thick and suffocating. Only the moment, fragile and dangerous, teetering on the edge of something we could never take back. Tell me to stop, he whispered. A challenge. A plea. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Then, his hand cupped the side of my face. Gently. Carefully. Like I was something fragile. Something breakable. I should have flinched. Should have turned away. But instead, I leaned into it. The second I did, something snapped. His grip tightened, fingers threading into my hair. His breath hitched, like he had been holding it in this whole time. And then a knock. A sound so sudden, so sharp, it felt like the world had split in two. I jerked back. The air between us shattered. I sucked in a breath, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. Isaac took a step back, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. Another knock. Miriam's voice. Linda? Are you awake? My stomach dropped. I turned, scrambling to put space between us, to make sure my voice sounded normal. Yeah. Just reading. Okay, honey. Just checking. The footsteps faded. The moment was gone. But the damage had already been done. I turned back to him. He was staring at me. Something in his eyes had changed. Something dark. Something unreadable. And then, without another word, he left. The second the door closed behind him, my legs gave out. I sank onto the bed, hands shaking, breath coming too fast. What had I done? What was I doing? This couldn't happen. It couldn't. But it almost had. And that scared me more than anything. Because in that moment, in the thick silence of my room, I realized something. I wasn't afraid of what had just happened. I was afraid of what would happen next. Because I knew this wasn't over. Not even close. I thought I could pretend it didn't happen. I thought if I didn't acknowledge it, if I acted like it was just a fleeting moment, a mistake, something that never really mattered, then it would disappear. That I could wake up the next morning and be the same person I was before. But I wasn't. And nothing felt the same. I avoided him. I didn't mean to. Or maybe I did. Maybe it was my way of keeping myself safe, of keeping us safe, of making sure that whatever almost happened never had the chance to happen again. I stopped going to the kitchen late at night. Stopped sitting in the living room when I knew he'd be there. Stopped looking up at dinner, afraid I'd find his eyes already waiting for mine. I made excuses, stayed in my room more than usual, buried myself in books I wasn't even reading. But no matter how much distance I put between us, it wasn't enough. Because I could still feel it. That moment. The way his breath had felt against my skin. The way his fingers had tangled in my hair. The way my body had betrayed me completely. I told myself it was over. that I had stopped it in time, that we hadn't actually done anything, that none of it counted. But guilt doesn't care about technicalities. And no matter how many times I told myself I had done the right thing, the weight of it pressed down on me like a secret I didn't know how to carry. And then there was him. Isaac. He changed after that night. Or maybe I was just finally noticing the things that had been there all along. At first, he was quiet, distant, didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me. And for a second, I thought maybe it was relief. Maybe he was just as shaken as I was. Maybe he had realized, just like I had, that this was dangerous. That we needed to stay away from each other. That night had been a mistake. A close call. A warning. And I thought maybe he understood that. Until I realized, it wasn't distance. It was control. He didn't avoid me. Not completely. He still watched me. From across the room. From the end of the hallway. In the reflection of the window when he thought I wouldn't notice. Like he was waiting for me to break first. Like he was giving me time to admit it. Like he knew something I didn't. And maybe he did. Because the longer I tried to pretend, the harder it became. It was in the way his presence felt different now. More solid. More real. Like he had shifted into something unshakable, something permanent. And I hated that I still felt it. The pull. Even after everything. Especially after everything. Then came the questions. Soft, subtle, casual enough that no one would think twice. "You two seem quiet lately," Miriam said one evening, tilting her head at me. I froze, my fingers tightening around my fork. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Just feels like you're not talking as much as before. Did something happen?" Isaac, sitting across from me, didn't look up. Didn't react. Just kept eating. Like he hadn't heard. Like he wasn't even listening. But I knew he was. Because I could feel it. That thick, suffocating weight in the air. The silence that stretched too long between us. I forced a smile. "Nothing happened," I said. "Just busy, I guess." She nodded, satisfied. But I saw the way my father glanced up at me. Just for a second. A flicker of something in his expression. Like he was noticing something too. The fear of being discovered settled deep inside me. Like a sickness. Like something crawling under my skin. Because suddenly, it felt like everyone was watching. Like they knew. Like I had the word guilty carved into my skin, visible for anyone who looked too closely. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't breathe when he was near me. But I couldn't breathe when he wasn't either. And that was the worst part. Because no matter how much I tried to erase it, to forget, to move past it, I couldn't stop wanting it. And that terrified me. Because the moment you start craving the thing that could destroy you, you're already lost. And I knew I was losing. The hardest part wasn't what almost happened. It wasn't the moment in my room. It wasn't the way my breath caught when his fingers brushed my skin. It wasn't even the way I wanted it. The hardest part was knowing that after everything, after the guilt, after the fear, after telling myself over and over again that this couldn't happen, I still wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. I hated myself for it. Hated the way my thoughts betrayed me. Hated the way my body still reacted whenever he was near. Because every time I told myself that night had been a mistake, that I had done the right thing by pulling away, that it was over, some quiet, treacherous part of me whispered back. "Then why do you still think about it? Why did my skin still burn where he touched me? Why did my stomach twist whenever he walked into a room? Why did my breath catch whenever I heard his footsteps down the hall? If it was just a mistake, if it had been nothing, then why did it still feel like it had changed everything?" I told myself it was loneliness. That's all it had ever been. I had spent so long feeling unseen, so long drowning in the silence of this house, that when someone finally noticed me, when someone finally looked at me like I mattered, I let myself fall into it. It didn't have to mean anything. It didn't have to be real. It was just a side effect of the emptiness. A symptom of being forgotten. That's what I told myself. But it wasn't the truth. Because deep down, I knew I wasn't just craving anyone's attention. I was craving his. And that scared me more than anything. I started avoiding him again. Not just in the house, but in my mind. Whenever a memory surfaced, whenever I caught myself lingering on the way he had looked at me that night, I forced myself to shut it down. Buried it. Pretended it wasn't there. I told myself that if I just ignored it long enough, if I pretended I had never felt it, then maybe it would disappear. Maybe I could go back to how things were before. Maybe I could undo it. Maybe I could fix myself. But Isaac wasn't letting me go that easily. He saw me pulling away. And he didn't like it. It started with small things. Little moments that forced me to acknowledge him, no matter how much I tried not to. A brush of his fingers against mine when he passed me something. A knowing glance across the dinner table, just long enough for me to feel it. A hand on the small of my back as he walked past, too quick to mean anything, too deliberate to mean nothing. Every time, my stomach clenched. Every time, my breath caught. Every time, I told myself I was overreacting. But I wasn't. Because I knew what he was doing. He was waiting. Testing me. Seeing how long I could keep pretending before I broke. And the worst part? I didn't know if I wanted to break. One night, I found myself standing outside his room. I don't know why. Maybe I had been walking to the kitchen. Maybe I had been looking for something, some way to distract myself. Maybe I had just been lost in my own head, in my own thoughts. But somehow my feet had carried me there. To him. And when I looked at his door, just a thin piece of wood separating us, I felt it again. That pull. That quiet, undeniable thing that I had spent weeks trying to bury. And in that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could walk away. I could turn around, go back to my room, close my door, and lock it behind me. I could end this now, before it was too late. Before I lost myself completely. Or, I could knock. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shake the walls. I stood there for what felt like forever. Frozen. Trapped between what I should do and what I wanted to do. And then I heard movement inside. Soft footsteps. A shift in the air. Like he could feel me there. Like he knew. I sucked in a breath. My hand lifted. I almost knocked. Almost. But then I turned around. Walked away. That was the moment I realized something. This wasn't just about Isaac. This was about me. Because for the first time in a long time, I had felt something. Something real. Something consuming. Something that made me forget, even for a second, how empty I had been before. And that was the real danger. Not him. Not this house. Not the possibility of getting caught. The real danger was that I wanted to feel this way. That I had spent so long being invisible, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop being seen. That I wasn't sure if I could. And that terrified me. Because if I couldn't trust myself, if I didn't even want to stop this, then how was I supposed to walk away? How was I supposed to save myself? And worse, did I even want to be saved? I never thought I would tell this story. Not because I forgot, how could I, but because I wasn't sure anyone would understand. Because I wasn't sure if I even understood. How do you explain something like this? How do you find the right words for something that was never supposed to happen in the first place? Something that lived in the spaces between silence and breath, between a touch that lingered and a look that lasted too long? How do you explain that the hardest part wasn't the fear of getting caught, it was the fear of wanting it too much? So now, I'll ask you. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where emotions took control? Where logic told you to walk away, but something deep inside kept pulling you back? Have you ever questioned everything you thought you knew about yourself, your boundaries, your desires, your own sense of right and wrong? If you have, tell me in the comments. Tell me if you've ever been caught in something you didn't see coming, or worse, something you did see coming and still couldn't stop. Because I need to know, was I just lonely? Or was it something more? I know I'm not alone in this. Emotions play tricks on us. They whisper things that aren't true. Or maybe they whisper the truth we've been too afraid to face. Either way, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, tell me what you would have done. And if you love stories like this, stories that take you deep into the shadows of human nature, stories that make you question everything, then make sure you subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because trust me, I have more stories that will make your jaw drop. And this? This was only one chapter. Loneliness is dangerous. It can make you see things that aren't there. Or worse, ignore the things that are. I used to think that if you knew something was wrong, you could stop yourself. That temptation was a choice. that the line between right and wrong was always clear. But it's not. It's a slow, quiet thing. It doesn't knock on your door all at once. It sneaks in through the cracks. And by the time you realize how deep you've gone, you don't even know if you want to get out. I walked away from that moment. I told myself I did the right thing, that I saved myself, that I escaped something that could have changed my life forever. But even now, I wonder, was it all in my head? Or was it real? And if it was real, what would have happened if I hadn't walked away?